Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Jenny Glenn Gingery. I'm the Associate Director of Communications and Media Relations at the Endocrine Society. Welcome to our first virtual Endo 2020 News Conference. We're going to be talking today about emerging technologies in the field. I just wanted to briefly thank our leadership, our staff, our speakers, and all of you for hanging in there with us. I know we were supposed to be in person in San Francisco, and we're very grateful to everyone for making the switch to this new technology as we've all had to adjust to the COVID-19 pandemic. So again, today we're going to be talking about emerging technologies in endocrinology, including one that may actually be used to address the pandemic. We're very pleased to have with us today Dr. Spiridula Maraca of the University of Arkansas for Medical Science and the Central Arkansas Veterans Healthcare System in Little Rock, as well as Dr. David Hopkins, Director of the Institute of Diabetes, Endocrinology, and Obesity at King's Health Partners in London. Over the next 20 minutes or so, each speaker will present their findings. We will have one Q&A session at the end of our time today. So everyone is muted except our presenters. We've done that to avoid any distracting noises like typing, sirens, pets, that sort of thing. So we do ask that you type any questions into the chat window. Once both of our speakers have finished their presentations, we'll be taking questions at the end. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel, as well as our online newsroom after the fact. You can catch up with any points you may have missed. And I'll be reading the questions out loud for the benefit of anyone who may be listening to that recording after the fact. I'd now like to go ahead and introduce our first presenter, Dr. Maraca.
Good morning, everyone from cloudy Little Rock. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm excited to share with you today our journey towards the first documented autonomous drone delivery of insulin. Jenny, next slide, please. You skipped one. Unmanned aerial vehicles, or drones as more commonly known, have become very popular in the modern society, where they're mostly used as recreational tools, such as for photography or to cover sports events such as racing. However, their use in order to transport medical products is still nascent, with the best examples seen in emerging economies with underdeveloped infrastructure, such as the jungles in East Africa or South Pacific Islands. A case in point is the Zipline is a drone company which has pioneered the delivery of blood products to Rwanda since 2016. This example highlights the potential of drones in disaster relief operations, where there is often significant disruption of the normal healthcare delivery channels. Next slide. So everything started in 2017 when Storm Ophelia hit Ireland. This was a Category 3 hurricane and Ireland's deadliest storm in the last 50 years. The streets were flooded and people were stranded at their homes for 3-4 days. Then in 2018, there was Storm Emma, which was a winter blizzard. And again, people were snowbound for almost a week. In both events, then we noticed that patients, including patients with diabetes, couldn't come to clinic, and they were having shortage of medical supplies, including insulin. It is very important to note that diabetes is one of the world's most common chronic diseases, affecting almost 400 million people. And insulin is a medication that is important to achieve and maintain glycemic control, and it could be life-saving for patients with diabetes. However, at that point, the medical management plan was passive, with everyone hoping that the weather would recede and these geographically isolated patients would once again have access to regular care and supplies. It was then that we realized that this is not good enough. Next slide. Medicine has a track record of practicing for emergencies before they actually happen. For example, all healthcare professionals would practice how to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation or CPR. We ensure protocols and resources are ready in case of emergency. So with that in mind, we thought of paving alternative ways for healthcare delivery by using drones to deliver a medication and return with a blood sample from a patient in a geographically isolated place. We picked Aran Islands off the west coast of Ireland in the Atlantic Ocean. We quickly realized that this project will be very challenging, as no one in the developed world had done drone deliveries beyond the visual line of sight, or BVLOS as we say, due to significant legislation surrounding flight operations. Next slide. So the first crucial step was to give a name to our project. So just like that, the diabetes drone mission was launched. We assembled a team of experts across different fields. Professor O'Keefe was the leader of this project, and he offered medical and technical expertise, and he was overseeing all steps of this mission. My role was to identify and address medical and regulatory issues surrounding healthcare delivery. Dr. Johnson offered technical expertise. From pharmaceutical standpoint, we had support from Novo Nordisk, a global healthcare company with diabetes products. And we also collaborated with All Care Pharmacy, the equivalent of CVS or Walgreens in US, that helped us with the medication dispense. We sought collaboration with Wingcopter, a German manufacturer of innovative drones for our equipment. SkyTago also supported all the flight operations. Through collaboration with SIS Ireland, we included in the team licensed BVLOS drone pilots with military expertise. Vodafone supported the telecommunications, and of course the Irish Aviation Authority had a crucial role, as it was the regulatory agency that gave the final approval. Next slide. Indicative of the multiple obstacles that we had to overcome was that from the concept of this project to the flight, it took 1 year. The flight happened on September 13, 2019. And one of the first challenges that we faced was that we wanted to perform a civilian drone flight covering more than 40 kilometers, when most of the self drones fly for about 1 to 10 kilometers. That meant, for example, that we had to ensure that the drone we choose will have enough battery life to complete the round trip. The other important challenge was that the currently legal drone operations were allowed for up to 300 meters, which is the line of sight, and we wanted to perform a BVLOS flight. To achieve that, we had to ensure that the drone will have a camera live feed through the flight, which in turn meant that we had to have uninterrupted 4G connectivity, even when the drone was flying over 400 feet in the ocean. We needed to have satellite telecom as backup, and the drone pilots were standby to take over the control in case of emergency. We had to comply with medication dispensing legislation, whereby we wouldn't just load insulin in the drone and let it fly, but we had to ensure that the physician would prescribe the medication, the pharmacy would dispense, and then we could load it to the drone. We also had to comply with the medication transportation cold chain legislation, whereby we had to ensure appropriate package and transport of the medication, monitoring temperature, ensuring that, for example, vibration would not compromise the medications. After ensuring safety and redundancy in all flight operations, we finally got the airspace regulatory approval. Next slide. So our technological solution was found in a Wingcopter 178 drone, or Seagull as we call it, in an autonomous without operator flight. Seagull covered 43.3 kilometers in a total duration of flight of 32 minutes. It was a flight beyond the visual line of sight. The seagull landed at Aden Islands, bringing insulin and glucagon, and when it landed, the whole team shouted, "The seagull has landed." It returned back to the mainland, bringing a blood sample from a patient for hemoglobin A1C testing. The drone flight between commercial flights, and at all times it was monitored and contactable as required by the Irish Aviation Authority. Next slide. There are multiple medical drone delivery opportunities that could be life-saving during sentinel events such as hurricanes, earthquakes, and of course pandemics like the one we're experiencing today. Medications and blood samples are ideal payload cargo due to their low weight and high value. We have an ongoing collaboration with the diabetes drone partners, including UPS, Wingcopter, and SkyTago, to roll out regular medical supply delivery service. I invite you all to watch the diabetes drone flight in a YouTube video and share the excitement of that day. Next slide. Here you can see the seagull in all its glory. On behalf of all the diabetes drone project team, thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maraca. I would now like to introduce Dr. Hopkins.
Thank you. So I'm going to be presenting the results of a sub-study of REVITA 2, the first sham-controlled double-blind prospective multi-center study of a new technique, duodenal mucosal resurfacing for the treatment of type 2 diabetes. Next slide. These are the disclosures which are available to view more fully online. Next slide. Notwithstanding current events, diabetes remains one of the biggest challenges to long-term world health as a chronic disease. And the rates of diabetes are increasing continuously. Over the last 30 years, there's been an explosion in medical technology around diabetes, with over 50 new drugs from 7 classes being approved by the FDA. However, despite this explosion in pharmacotherapy, overall results for type 2 diabetes remain static, with a significant proportion of patients having suboptimal blood glucose control and not achieving the levels of control that would be expected to reduce long-term health issues related to diabetes. From this data, it is clear that a new approach is required in the management of diabetes. Next slide. Sometimes such new approaches can come from unexpected places. And indeed, one of the areas where we've seen change, which may not be expected, was from the experiences of people undergoing weight loss, so-called bariatric or metabolic surgery. These operations were initially developed primarily for weight loss and involve bypassing the duodenum. But in addition to weight loss, these procedures have been shown to have dramatic effects on metabolic parameters relating to diabetes. And these effects occur before any weight loss. This indicated that the duodenum has a key role in metabolic regulation and identified it as a target for further therapy. Next slide. What we wanted to consider, was the impact of whether some of the changes we see in bariatric surgery can be manipulated and developed with a minimally invasive procedure. What we've come to learn over the years from the initial work on bariatric surgery is the duodenal mucosa, the cell lining that faces the lumen of the duodenum, is a very metabolically active and endocrine center and has a key role in regulating insulin action. Also, it's been demonstrated that in an animal model fed on a high-fat, high-sugar diet, there are changes in the duodenal mucosa from a normal pattern to a hyperplastic pattern. And this is associated with multiple abnormalities, including changes in gut hormone signaling, impact of bile acid signaling, changes in micronutrients and in the microbiome. And this appears to be a maladaptive response to diet that may drive some of the metabolic abnormalities underlying type 2 diabetes. It was therefore hypothesized and subsequently demonstrated in initial pilot work that changing the structure of the duodenal mucosa back to the pre-diabetes state could reverse some aspects of diabetes. And from this, the Revita technique was developed. The Revita technique indicated in the cartoon on the right-hand side of the slide is an endoscopic procedure lasting typically about 45 minutes and performed as a day case. Under endoscopic guidance, a catheter is placed. The wall of the duodenal mucosa is separated out by a submucosal injection. And then a controlled thermal injury is applied by passing hot fluid through the balloon element of the catheter. This results in immediate changes in the mucosa of the duodenum, which lead to it regressing to a less hypertrophied form over a period of a very short time, over days. Next slide. And following initial studies demonstrating that this could have significant effects on blood glucose control, we developed the Revita 2 protocol for the first sham-controlled study. People with suboptimally controlled diabetes, defined by A1C of 7.5 to 10% on one or more oral agents, were randomized 1-to-1 to either a full procedure or a sham procedure. And our main endpoints were blood glucose control at 24 weeks and liver fat measured by MRI at 12 weeks. The primary outcomes were both met with significant improvements in HbA1c at 24 weeks and improvements in liver fat similar or better than had been seen in specific studies of tentative agents for management of fatty liver disease. Next slide. Also within this protocol, as a secondary endpoint, we looked at the effects of the procedure on glucose metabolism, insulin glucagon secretion, using a mixed meal tolerance protocol. The mixed meal tolerance test, or MMTT, is a standard test to measure beta cell function and insulin resistance based on a standardized liquid meal containing a fixed amount of glucose and protein. And samples are drawn over 2 hours. This slide shows the primary results of the mixed meal tolerance test, showing that the glucose excursion, here shown as the average mixed meal tolerance glucose over 2 hours, is significantly reduced in those people having active procedure compared to sham, and demonstrating a significant effect of the procedure on post-meal glycemia, consistent with the improvement in HbA1c seen as the primary endpoint. Next slide. Interestingly, this change was seen to be predominantly related to a significant improvement in fasting glucose in the DMR compared to sham, with only a small change in postprandial glucose excursion relative to the fasting glucose. And this indicates a likely primary effect on insulin action. Next advance. We further looked at this in more detail in a subgroup who had fasting glucose greater than 180 mg per deciliter, a level that is associated with significant evidence of insulin resistance and poor glycemic control. And in this series of graphs, you can see first on the left that as with the main group, there is a substantial improvement in the mixed meal tolerance test area under the glucose curve, the change in glucose over 2 hours post-meal, but also significant changes in beta cell function and alpha cell function, with improvement in C-peptide as a marker of insulin secretion and a reduction in glucagon. This is important because this series of data demonstrate improvements in insulin sensitivity with improvements in insulin secretion and reduction in glucagon, which is another key driver of glucose dysregulation in diabetes. Taken together, these findings demonstrate that the Revita DMR procedure has major changes on the glucose metabolism in diabetes and indicates an apparent effect on some of the underlying defects that drive type 2 diabetes, i.e. insulin sensitivity or impaired insulin sensitivity being improved, and improvements in insulin secretion and in reduction in glucagon. Taken together with the other findings indicating their improvement in liver fat, these data show a broad range of metabolic benefits of DMR and potential to alter the natural history of type 2 diabetes in a way that existing pharmacotherapy may not offer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hopkins. I'm now going to open the floor for questions. Please go ahead and type your questions into the chat window, along with your full name if it's not already on there and your affiliation, and we'll turn those over to Dr. Maraca and Dr. Hopkins. Dr. Maraca, while we're waiting, could you shed a bit of light on how are the drones being considered for use in the COVID-19 pandemic?
That's a really great question. I was expecting something like that. Well, I mean, I think this pandemic is another example of how drones could be helpful in delivering medication or any other kind of supplies in patients that maybe they're quarantined, or even communities that are completely isolated. As I said during my presentation, we are currently working with our diabetes drone partners in order to establish a more regular medical service. However, we are not there yet, but hopefully in the future we will be able to do something like that. But I can see how, for example, drones could be used not only to deliver medication, but even to, for example, do like, transfer testing or blood products and so on.
Great, thank you. Dr. Hopkins, I have a question from Jill Roulette at Endocrine Today. She was wondering, did the results differ by BMI?
Sure, we haven't got data on that. The BMI range for the study was 24 to 40. One might expect to be some relationship in terms of weight, particularly waist circumference associated with insulin action. But we don't have specific data, and given the numbers, it may be difficult to make a post hoc analysis for that point.
Great, thank you. Dr. Hopkins, I have another question from Megan Brooks at Reuters Health. She's wondering, what is the next step? How far is this from routine use?
Sure. So the technique has now received regulatory approval in Europe. They're not yet in the United States, and is now ready for rollout. In fact, the first clinical service has just been launched, but sadly, because of the current pandemic situation, the rollout has been suspended. We were hoping to treat the first routine clinical patients this month, but obviously that will resume now once normality returns. And that's in London.
Harith is online. Harith, would you like to chime in here? And could you share everybody your work, what your position is at Fractal?
Sure. Thank you so much. My name is Harith Rajagopalan, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Fractal. And Dr. Hopkins is a principal investigator in the study, and we're so pleased to have the opportunity to work with him. With the BMI question, earlier studies really did not reveal any relationship between starting BMI and the glycemic or the liver benefit that we saw from our procedure. And we will be looking at this more carefully as we go forward. Thanks so much. I can chime in as needed on future questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. Dr. Maraca, I have a question from Sherry Roan with Everyday Health, I believe. The question is, what challenges do you foresee in scaling up a drone-based medication delivery program?
This is a great question. As I was saying during my presentation, the most challenging was to be able to comply with all the regulations from the airspace authorities. So especially in areas where they're more like densely habited, I think it would be more challenging to establish this kind of delivery services. And another great point is the public. I mean, in the past there have been news where there were like drone accidents and so on. So I think it is very important to gain the public's confidence in this, and that will be another challenge in the future.
Great. Professor O'Keefe, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so just I would agree with Dr. Maraca. One of the challenges in this drone delivery enterprise is to make sure that we're doing things in a stepwise approach with the regulators at all times. That includes the aviation regulators, the medication regulators, and so on. A lot of things with drone deliveries are kind of over-promised and then under-delivered. So what we expect to see initially is kind of a scaling up of operations, initially in kind of remote rural areas. And then as the protocols and technology improves, then it'll become more mainstream in the months and years ahead.
Great, thank you. Dr. Hopkins, I have a question from Miriam Tucker with Medscape. She asks, which patients would be considered the best candidates for Revita?
Sure. So based on the data we've got so far, we've done this particular study in people who are failing on one or more oral agents. So people who are going to have their treatment escalated, potentially to injectable medication or additional oral agents. We know that this procedure works effectively in people who've got some degree of preserved insulin secretion. And we therefore think that it's probably most appropriate relatively early in the course of diabetes, where it has the greatest benefit in terms of potentially reducing or changing the natural history of the condition. We think that the actual indication is very wide. Although the studies to date have been people already on oral agents, on theoretical grounds, we expect that may extend indeed to earlier use in diabetes. So I think very broad, but right now, best evidence is for those people who are on one or more oral agents with suboptimal control, but with evidence of preserved beta cell function.
Great. Kristen Monaco with MedPage Today has another question for you, Dr. Hopkins. She's asking, when might this be available as a treatment option, which I know you spoke a little bit about.
Yep. So as mentioned before, it is, once the pandemic ends, the first clinical commercial service will launch fully in London. So in Europe, it has regulatory approval. And so that's ready to go.
Great. For Dr. Maraca, I have a question from Albert Kai at Close Concerns. Have you considered rolling out the drone delivery in areas with less reliable infrastructure and fewer regulatory restrictions, similar to what Zipline has done in Rwanda?
That's a great question. I think the key point here is that this kind of flights have, as Mr. Albert Guy mentions, have happened in underdeveloped areas. The key point here is that we need something like that also in the developed areas, and that's why we started this project in Ireland. And our main goal is to be able to be able to offer this in the future for the developed world.
Wonderful, thank you. Dr. Hopkins, I have a question from Ria Tang at Close Concerns. Are there dietary restrictions for patients that undergo the resurfacing procedure? Will patients need to have this procedure performed on a consistent basis?
Sure. So dietary restrictions are minimal. In the immediate post-op procedure, there is a gradual reintroduction of normal diet over a period of 2 weeks. So initially for the first, immediately post-procedure, patients are asked to take a liquids transform into a soft diet and then to resume normal food. What we do advise, and we've supported people with, is that they should be considering lifestyle changes post-procedure. Given that the theoretical basis of the changes in the duodenum are probably related to diet, we encourage people to follow standard healthy eating advice as given for people with diabetes more generally. With regard to the potential for retreatment, Harith may wish to comment further on that point. We do have data from another study going out to 2 years showing evidence of sustained benefit. And if Harith wants to come in, may want to comment further on that in terms of other potential there.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Hopkins. We do have data that we presented publicly toward the end of last year from an earlier Revita 1 study, of which Dr. Hopkins was also a part, where we had durability from a single procedure through at least 2 years of follow-up. And as a consequence, we are anticipating that this could be a procedure with quite long-lasting benefits. And we'll anticipate that in the future, we may need to ask whether this procedure would need to be repeated, and if so, with what frequency and which patients. But right now, we appear to have evidence suggesting that this could be very durable in a substantial fraction of patients who see benefit early on. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. That's all the questions we have at this time. Anyone else have any final questions for the chat window? Please go ahead and type them there. I would just remind the group, we have announced details of our Endo 2020 online virtual meeting that's going to be happening in June. So please watch your inboxes for that. You can email any questions to media@endocrine.org. And also we are going to have one more presentation on artificial intelligence and osteoporosis that's related to emerging technology. That one is going to be this evening at 5 p.m. Eastern. We just couldn't quite get all 3 speakers in the same time zone where everyone was awake. So we appreciate your understanding there. And that appears to be all the questions. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you back here at 11:30 a.m. Eastern for our Diabetes News Conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you.
Thank you.